As the name suggests, tonight we are going to be talking about famous photographers. I placed a poll up on the group to get feedback on what people were looking for. So I have put together a selection of 5 photographers that cover a range of different genres and interests. And the aim of this is to try and inspire you, to give you some ideas about the kind of things that you might like to do. Now, one of the very important things about this that comes up time and time again is that when looking at the work of other photographers, whether this is famous photographers or whether you're on an online group, whether it's our own community or on any other kind of photography group, there can be a fine line between inspiration and intimidation, where when you see someone take a shot and you think, oh, well, you know, how in the world could I possibly do that? But the main thing about this, as I'm going to be trying to illustrate here, is that everyone started somewhere, and a lot of these people who take these pictures, from a technical standpoint, a lot of it's not hugely complicated. A lot of what they do is about being in the right place at the right time. So the best thing that you can possibly do is get out and take your camera with you and take as many pictures as you can, which is everything that this camera club's about. So let us jump in, assuming it'll work. So these are the 5 photographers that we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to be taking a look at Annie Leibovitz, Robert Mapplethorpe, Henri Cartier Bresson, Oscar Marzaroli, and Ansel Adams. Now, this is a curious thing because these are all relatively famous photographers. One's more locally known than others, but these are some of the biggest names in photography. But a lot of the time people get into the hobby and they take their pictures, they focus on their own work, and they don't necessarily know about everything that's come before them. So just as a kind of quick bit of interest here, who can give me a quick show of hands? First of all, easy one, who's heard of Annie Leibovitz? Pretty much everybody. Robert Mapplethorpe? Maybe about a quarter of you. Cartier Bresson? About half. Marzaroli? Almost everybody. And Ansel Adams? Everybody. Excellent. So these are, as I say, quite well-known people, but hopefully I'll be able to teach you a little something new about them. But also, as we're here, what I'd like to do is, while we're looking at these, it gives us an opportunity to look at the photos, examine them, and potentially give critique. We've talked about doing critique within the club, looking at our own photos. We've considered this in terms of giving feedback to one another. And there's a certain mentality that some people have that pictures by great photographers are sacrosanct, that they cannot be criticized, they are beyond that. But as some of these people actually say, nobody is beyond that. You should always look at things with a critical eye to see what you can learn from them and how things have possibly evolved over the decades since these photos have been taken. Another thing to be aware of here is, of course, there is no photo in the world that will appeal to everybody. Photography is an art form as much as it is a science, and therefore there will be some pictures here that people will absolutely love. There will be some pictures here that people don't care for. The main thing is that that gives us a good discussion opportunity at the end of the presentation. So let's jump in and talk about Annie Leibovitz, Robert Mapplethorpe, Henri Cartier Bresson, Oscar Marzaroli, and Ansel Adams. Each of these I've placed next to one of their most famous and iconic pictures, the images that most sum up them as a photographer. Annie Leibovitz starts what tends to be a trend with a lot of the photographers that we're going to be talking about this evening. So Annie Leibovitz didn't actually start out as a photographer. Like so many of the people that we'll be talking about tonight, she actually started out studying art. However, because a lot of the different art skills that tend to have come up within the 20th century involve the use of mixed media, combining painting and sculpture with things like photography and video, a lot of people tend to dabble in photography. And as you'll know yourselves, once you start, it tends to become addictive. It tends to become something that you really want to do. So once Leibovitz tended to travel a lot, just shooting with whatever camera she had to hand. But when she graduated, she then worked and applied towards the then very new Rolling Stone magazine. She worked there at the time for a couple of years, but after only 2 years, she got promoted to the position of head photographer. Now, during that time, Rolling Stone was quite a different thing to how we think of it now. Back then, it was as much about photojournalism as anything else. So with Rolling Stone, a lot of her initial works were kind of going around and photographing different events candidly. This is one of her colleagues who worked with her at the time, a famous author and slightly crazy person, Hunter S. Thompson, who, again, even though this is just a kind of candid shot, it does capture a lot of what makes Leibovitz's portraiture so interesting. The fact that she can capture a unique character within a single image. It shows Thompson as the workaholic, and also, again, capturing at a particular time frame, sitting there on a plane, smoking his iconic cigarette. So as she kind of worked for Rolling Stone magazine, she found herself getting sent out on more and more appointments. But the one that really made the biggest impact on her career, which cemented her as a major photographer to be kept an eye on, was Nixon's final day in office. When she was there, as the story goes, there was a massive collection of the press pack, huge amounts of photographers jostling with one another trying to get the picture. And as a result, as you tend to see with these things, you've got, 20 or 30 photos of the same thing with slightly different angles. However, Leibovitz decided that the more interesting story would actually be after he left. This was the end of his career, which obviously didn't end under the best of circumstances. So she waited until he was gone. Now, by this point, every other photographer had left. They'd gotten their picture and scarpered because they had their deadlines to meet. Whereas she waited and got this picture of the helicopter taking off and the red carpet there being packed away. So the thing is, this one shot ended up catapulting her into a certain amount of stardom, which is then when she went on to get her career as the head photographer. So she held that position for 10 years, and during that time, Leibovitz was considered one of the main influencers of the style of the times. Rolling Stone went on to become kind of the iconic magazine that defined that generation. So when we think about Leibovitz, we tend to think about her work with celebrities, and this is where it kind of came from. She started out a lot of the time by working with touring bands. She actually did go on tour with the Rolling Stones, and through that she then got to know various other celebrities, and she started doing pictures. So during this time, she started to develop what would go on to become what some would say is her signature style, which tends to be bold, quite elaborate compositions which make use of strong and vibrant colours. Also, what she ended up doing was flaunting slightly with controversy, which again will come back later. A lot of her subjects were not quite pushing the boundaries, but were close to them. And so at the time, they tended to make people feel a little bit uncomfortable, but also they tended to get quite a strong reaction. Speaking of which, this next picture is possibly her most famous photograph of all time. I'd imagine you have seen this image before, the image that kind of sums up, and many people say, the relationship between John Lennon and Yoko Ono. The story behind this photo is absolutely fascinating for a number of reasons. The first thing is that this picture was one of the last ones taken in the set. She tried to take a variety of different pictures, and from the way the story was told, Ono just wasn't interested in it. I think, being a very creative person herself, there was a bit of a conflict there. So you can see some of the other stills from the contact sheets of this, and where they're all clothed, and it's slightly awkward. So then she says, okay, well, tell you what, let's do something different. Let's, we'll do some nudes. To which Ono went, no, I'm not taking my clothes off. But Lennon was more than happy to do so. So they took a variety of pictures like this. And again, she was quite resistant, but he was willing to go for it. So what ended up happening is you get this picture where he's being very, very affectionate. She tends to be quite distant, and it creates quite a striking image. What's also particularly unique about this is I believe this was taken the day before he died. Yes, so was it right after? Was it the same day? Yeah, I know. So basically, this was pretty much the last picture of his life. So something this iconic within the photo of itself, also within its cultural context, got an extra significance. So it's a very, very powerful image in that regard. Now, another thing that defines Leibovitz's work and her life is Susan Sontag, the woman who literally wrote the book on photography. Anyone get that joke? No? She wrote a very, very famous series of essays about the ethical and moral implications of photography called On Photography. And as we all know, when you explain a joke, it becomes funnier. So What was controversial, or to some at the time, was the fact that Leibovitz and Sontag were often regarded as close friends at the time, companions, but after Sontag's death, and as society kind of moved forward, it came to light that the two were in fact partners, lovers. And Leibovitz, one of the things that makes her so interesting as well is the fact that she puts so much of her own personal life into her photography, as well as her commercial work. She has her own personal work. There is a fantastic book that she produced, which was released not long after the death of Sontag, which was, it was a series of images from their time together from 1990 to 2005, which showed both their personal lives, but also kind of her commercial work at the time and how they influenced one another. Also around the same time that Sontag died, Leibovitz's father also died. So she found that rather than some people who would maybe throw themselves into their work to try and get away from something like this, in a lot of the interviews that I'd seen, she said she kind of took the pain and used that as a means of expressing herself. So a lot of her work took on slightly darker tones and subject matters. So as we move forward, we get into what we would tend to consider like her modern era. This tends to be the very popular era where she is probably without a doubt the world's #1 celebrity portrait photographer. Anytime you see photos of celebrities, a lot of the time she is the person behind them. And again, you can see that strong grasp of colour here, this being one of the promo photos for the 2012 Les Miserables production, which is, of course, the iconic shot of, I want to say Cosette, is that the name of the character? It's been so long since I saw that production. But again, this is essentially a recreation of the painting that's often used for the posters of these things, and this went on to be used as the main image for most of the publicity. It does have very, very striking visuals, both in terms of the deep blues of the eyes, but also the kind of expression. Again, as we're looking forward, we get to kind of collections of well-known celebrities. This is one of the world's famous most favourite bromances, Sir Ian McKellen and Sir Patrick Stewart's. This is one of the promo photographs for their 2013 production of Waiting for Godot. And again, I really like the fact that it's relatively simple, as I'm saying, in terms of the lighting. But what you have is so much of the expression of the individuals. And a lot of that, I mean, they are actors, obviously. But again, if you ever watch any behind-the-scenes documentaries, her ability to interact with people is a large part of what makes her such a good photographer. But then you also get slightly more peculiar things like this. So this is Kim, Kanye, and I think Northwest, the peculiarly named baby. And this kind of has slightly more of a candid flair to it, but it's still got, again, the strong colours, the filters, the interesting composition. And by most accounts, those two are a particularly challenging pair to work with. So the fact that she was able to get not this, but a whole series of interesting photos for Vogue proves that, you know, again, she can work under challenging environments and still get some very, very interesting shots. Now, what's curious about this is that Leibovitz is, as I say, known mostly for her commercial work, her work with Rolling Stone and Vogue, and Vanity Fair as well. But despite her commercial work, she's never been afraid to push boundaries and attempt to court controversy, both in terms of creating interesting pictures, but trying to achieve something through it. This, again, is one of her most famous pictures. This was of Demi Moore in 1984, taken when she was heavily pregnant. This was very controversial because it produces what at the time was deemed a scandalously sexualized portrait of pregnancy. Up until this point, pregnancy was mostly meant to be considered a very, very private thing. Even for celebrities, it was, you know, you were pregnant, you went off, you had your baby quietly, and then you came out with a baby. Whereas this, many people have argued, kind of gave rise to many women being more comfortable with their bodies, but also the rise of like a lot of the kind of publicity that goes around the pregnancy nowadays. That, you know, well, again, Kim Kardashian there, I think, did a photo shoot for her pregnancy. It becomes quite a common thing nowadays. So it's funny that for every trend, there is somebody who starts it. So a lot of this began here. Now, this next one is also controversial, but history has proved interesting in this one, because this is an incredibly controversial picture of Miley Cyrus not wearing a lot of clothes. Now, here in the year 2020, that seems like a ridiculous thing because of what's happened in the past 10 years of her sort of growing up. But back in 2008, she was still a children's television star. She was still Hannah Montana. And so this was done, there was a setting where it was Miley and her father. They were doing a series of portraits for the two of them. And at the time of this, I believe she was only 15. So what ended up happening is there was a massive, massive outcry with people saying that they had corrupted and ruined and destroyed the girl, to the extent that all of these wonderful people who were looking out for her well-being demonized young Miley a tremendous amount, to the fact that she had to make a kind of tearful apology for daring to do something like this. And then 10 years later, as these things tend to be done, she posted on Twitter, she posted this photo on the 10th anniversary and said, "Fuck y'all, I'm not sorry." So, you know, keeping it classy. And then lastly here we have, of course, the Vanity Fair cover from 2015 with the then and now still very controversial transition of, you know, I can never remember Caitlyn's name beforehand. I didn't follow. Bruce Jenner into Caitlyn Jenner. So this was one of the cover images of the time, a thing that suddenly pushed a lot of the concept of trans rights into the forefront and brought a lot of discussion to the topic. Some of it useful, some of it not. One of the things that is interesting about this photo, though, is, again, at this point, Leibovitz is one of the biggest photographers in the world, and it just kind of gives you an idea of how much media sway the sort of Jenners and Kardashians have, and the fact that you can sit there and go, okay, I'm going to call up Annie Leibovitz, and I want a front cover, and even with a controversial subject, you can do that. So again, even though this is a documentary of her own work, it also very much reflects the times that we're in. Last thing I'll say, though, is if we talk about Leibovitz and talk about her style, I've previously talked about her interest in colour. But what's curious about that is I've watched a lot of documentaries, read a lot of articles about this as I've been researching it. And Leibovitz, unlike anyone else that I've got here, has the most flexible style of everybody. By which I mean that because she's a very highly commercial photographer, her technique, her style, her way of doing things has always had to evolve with the changing times. By which I mean that all of her work in Rolling Stone in the early days was black and white. She was a dedicated black and white photographer. However, as colour print became more and more of a thing, she had to start incorporating colour into her images. As she got more and more famous, her shoots started getting bigger and bigger, until this shoot back in 2013 is a good example of what is probably one of the biggest brands in the world. Does anybody know which company, which huge company, Disney, absolutely. So Disney, the company that I think by now owns about 75% of the entertainment industry, commissioned Leibovitz for this shoot. And so you've got, again, Taylor Swift, at the time one of the biggest artists in the world, doing a shot like this. Now you could look at that and sit there and go, oh, well, she's just sitting on a bench and that's all Photoshop. But no. They built a tower. They had a wind machine. Obviously the hair's not real because that would be a bit difficult to manage. But as her fame and her ability has expanded, so has the scale of the things that she's doing, so that she doesn't tend to do a lot of the smaller stuff now. Everything tends to be a big production with big names. Now, the next picture here, the last one I've got in the series, is not a big picture in terms of its complexity. As I mentioned before, not all of these are technically impossible, but you may recognize the person in this. Slightly famous person, and the picture hasn't loaded properly. But yeah, she's got to the extent where now royalty are contacting her and asking for portraits. So she has managed to go from relatively humble beginnings, although starting out quite quickly, and getting to be pretty much the biggest working name in photography in the modern era. So, Annie Leibovitz is a good example of a commercial portrait photographer. Some people say that sometimes she sort of straddles the line between portraiture and fashion, but a lot of her stuff tends to be kind of documentary of famous people. And that is a large part of her appeal, that you recognize the faces, you get the big presentations. The next photographer that we're taking a look at here is Robert Mapplethorpe. Now, I will confess, before taking this research, I'd been to a lecture about him previously, but I had never had a huge amount of interest in his work. However, in researching his biography and looking at his work, I think I spent longer looking at Mapplethorpe than anyone else. He's sometimes labelled a fashion photographer, sometimes labelled as an alternative photographer, because Mapplethorpe worked extensively with people on the kind of fringes of society. Curiously enough, Mapplethorpe, like many of the others that we're looking at, started with painting. He studied at a school of art. He was a painter working again in mixed media, kind of recurring themes here. But he worked in the Greenwich Village, which seems to be, I don't know a huge amount about it personally, but from what I understand, it's kind of very artistic commune, and he worked with a lot of different artists, in particular his sort of close friend, Patti Smith. So a lot of his early work was just done using Polaroid cameras, just so that he could take shots to use in his other work. But what he found is that the more that he was taking pictures, again, the more that he started falling in love with the medium of photography. So he then took the next step, and instead of going for Instamatic, he went for something more permanent, got himself a larger camera, and immediately started doing a lot of portraits. So a lot of these were collaborations with, some of them were just sort of regular people, some of them were performers, but pretty much all of them were his close personal friends. So you've got his varying different shots of Patti Smith here, but you also have Lisa Lyon, who was a very, very famous bodybuilder at the time. So the thing about her is that a lot of people did shoots with her. She was a very popular subject, but Mapplethorpe went a little bit further. He tended to do things that, again, it's interesting with our future space brains here. We can look at these things and go, why is that controversial? You see worse than an advert. But at the time, this stuff was so controversial that he actually struggled to get any of his work published. So much of what he was doing, he would send it off to publications, and they call it smut, they call it pornography, which by his own admission, some of it was, but they wouldn't do any of his work. But he found that exhibitions and private collectors, he started becoming popular with many of those. In terms of a lot of his work, he tended to experiment with the human form. So he did a lot of artistic work with nude male and nude female models, but in terms of his males, they were almost entirely shot with African American males. His reasoning for this is that he did most of his work in black and white, and he said that the tones tended to work very, very well in their body. You can see the dark skin with the white highlights shining through. He did also do some work with celebrities, but again, it didn't tend to be, the biggest mainstream figures at the time. It tended to be slightly more unusual or alternative ones, kind of leaning towards the kind of punk aesthetic here. And some of his work was, shall we say, unusual. So anytime that he was working, again, he tried to keep things, oddly enough, despite the controversy of his material, his actual compositions tended to be, as many people said, quite classical, quite standard. There's not a huge amount of elaborate, the painting certainly, but in terms of the framing, in terms of the styling around it, there's not a huge amount. So as I said, a lot of the work that he did was with fringe societies. So he tended to work a lot with African American communities, but also with the gay community and the S&M community. So a lot of his work was capturing them and documenting a lot of the things that they were going through. This, of course, a lot of this was happening during the time of the AIDS crisis. So a lot of the people that he photographed here ended up, unfortunately, being involved in that. So again, his subject matter was the most important thing here. Whenever he was capturing it, he wanted something that was different, something that was a little off from the norm. And part of what made him so successful was how willful he was, despite the fact that people were telling him that his photography was, it was pornographic, it was profane, that it shouldn't be allowed, there were people campaigning against it. He was absolutely determined that he was going to make it, that he was going to be famous. Curiously enough, there's actually a recent biopic of Mapplethorpe that I think came out last year, starring Matt Smith of Doctor Who fame as him. I discovered this while researching this, so I've not seen it, but it does look interesting, so we could have a Camera Club movie night sometime. So again, he was photographing people within the S&M community was a big part of his work, which again has its own controversies there, simply because a lot of the time this is quite private things that he's then documenting and recording, but because of his close relationships with these people, in many cases they were his friends and lovers, he was able to get these unique pictures. But also, again, the subject matter is something that back in the 80s, especially in the height of the AIDS crisis, was seen as awful, as terrible. The concept of like this particular picture I found quite striking, which is, you know, two men embracing in quite a sort of what would traditionally be a, you know, male female quite loving embrace, but with same genders there. And again, people absolutely hated this at the time, but again, a lot of people liked it. But one of the curious things that parallels so much of Mapplethorpe's work is the way in which his own life was affected by this. Mapplethorpe actually contracted AIDS, and so that was inevitably what led to his death. But again, rather than shy away from anything controversial, he actually chose to embrace it and did a series of self-portraits capturing his decay. Because one of the strange things about the AIDS crisis, again, didn't live through it personally, but I've seen documentaries of it, but I'd imagine for some of you this might be, you know, more memory than anything else. But from what I can gather, it seemed to be quite a hidden thing. It was like a thing that happened to communities that people didn't want to talk about, and it was a thing that happened behind closed doors, whereas here's a famous photographer documenting every stage of his breakdown, and so, but not just documenting that, but kind of engaging with it, so that you see him kind of gradually wasting away, to the extent where some of his last pictures were taken just days before he died. But again, curiously enough, one of the pictures was him like at an exhibition, so he was still engaging and working despite being very, very ill. Very, very odd thing about Mapplethorpe, by the way, is that he's known predominantly for two things, which tends to be his kind of fashion portraiture work with controversial subjects. Does anyone know what his second favourite subject is? Yeah. Still life, flowers. So he did a whole series of still life pictures of flowers. And one of the fascinating things about this is just how different this was from anything else, but how in his idea, everything was kind of pulled together. Now, one of the things that I was talking about here is having a look at the photographer's work, analysing it, trying to interpret it. But the great thing about the fact that these are all photographers of the 20th century is that we actually have not just image documents of their work, but also, as they're all famous, pretty much everyone has at some point engaged in an interview. So I have a couple of snippets of Mapplethorpe in his own words.
There was a feeling I could get through looking at pornographic imagery that I thought had never been apparent in art.
I suppose I'm saying, did you set out to shock?
No. I mean, it was sort of too selfish to really, it was about me wanting to see things. And it wasn't, you know, certainly me first, and secondary to that was the audience. But I was always amazed that it shocked. I mean, it just, because once I had a photograph and I had taken it, it wasn't shocking to me anymore. I'd been through the experience. Somehow, I was able to pick up the magic of the moment and work with it. You know, that's my rush in doing photography. You know, it's like you get to a place and you can do it with a flower, you can do it with a cock, you can do it with a portrait, where it's really kind of like, you don't know why it's happening, but it's happening. You've like somehow tapped into a space that's magic.
So yeah, interesting way with words. But it's curious that one of the things that comes up a lot here between different photographers is the conflict between preparation and inspiration. Some of the photographers here are all about the technical aspects of it and about getting the shot set up as much as possible, whereas others are more about the importance of the moment, the momentary capturing the exact instant that you need. And again, these are all famous and great photographers, vastly different opinions, but they're all respected within their own medium. So one of the things that we can definitely take away from this is the fact that there is no one way of taking pictures. There is no one correct approach to photography. It's about finding the approach that works best to you, developing that and growing that. Now, the next one we're going to be talking about is one of my personal favorites and one of the most famous photographers of all time, Henri Cartier-Bresson. I put there that he's a photojournalist, but actually many people credit him with essentially being the photojournalist, as in the man who created the concept of photojournalism. So, running theme here, which is, once again, he started off studying painting, but when traveling the world, which is a thing that would come on to define his entire life and his experiences, he got himself a basic camera and absolutely fell in love. So as he started working in photography, a lot of his early work was very, very just simple, as in he just traveled wherever he could and took pictures of anything at all that was there. So what's curious about Bresson and what a lot of people say is his ability to capture what is known as the decisive moment, the term coined from a book that he wrote on the subject, the ability to capture the precise time that gives you the best possible photo. What's curious about some of these works, by the way, is Bresson was constantly critical of his own work. He would take a picture and he would never look back at it. He was happy if other people would like it, but he never drew any kind of inspiration from that himself. Looking back at this, which is one of his most famous early pictures, when shown this on a documentary, his reaction was, "It's out of focus." He also dislikes this picture because he didn't believe in any form of post-production. He was an absolute photographic purist and he believes that all cropping should be done within the camera, so he didn't believe in cropping the edges in. This is one of his few famous crop pictures because there's a massive pillar there, and he felt like probably it wasn't the best shot. Also, the reason that he attributes this to being out of focus is because this shot is actually shot through a railing, much the same as on the other side, and he couldn't physically push his camera any further forward, so he couldn't get it to focus. But again, this image captures an absolute particular moment. But what's curious is it's not just a random snapshot. Everything within this picture is very, very nicely placed. I particularly love the reflection in the still water in the bottom right there.
There is actually a print of that on display at home.
Oh, excellent.
And I was actually surprised at, I'd only seen smaller prints of it in books, and I was actually surprised at how out of focus it was, but I say it is the moment is exactly what it's all about. That feel just about to touch the water.
Yep. Well, it raises a very interesting point about discussion I was having with one of you just the other week, which is about photography and how you get feedback on this. One of the things that comes up a lot in competitions is that you're gauged on a certain scale by the official recommendations for most of the Camera Club competitions. And a good half of that is made up of technical competence. So the idea is that your picture has to be technically perfect before it will even be considered. But there are certain examples, I mean, if I go back here, where you can have a picture that is not technically perfect. It is out of focus, it has some motion blur there, but it's something within the picture, something within the artistry, within the moment that makes it fascinating and interesting. I once saw, as tends to happen a lot, an argument on an online discussion group. I know, don't be too shocked. But it was, somebody was talking about how there was a book, there was a book called "It Doesn't Always Have to Be in Focus." And they were arguing that that's why you should never have to focus any of your pictures. It later turned out that he'd forgotten to turn the autofocus on his camera, and this was all him enthusiastically covering up for a mistake. But it did, in amongst all of the nonsense and shouting and screaming, get some very, very interesting discussions about this very topic. But this,
the thing is, I mean, that's 1932, and obviously he was a fantastic photographer, and it makes it a great image. But if that was shot in 2020,
to be
it would
fair,
be a great shot of it.
you could argue definitely that in many ways the art form's moved on.
Party that's made things
Well,
seem great as well,
possibly. To be honest, I would argue that Bresson's work still stands up. Like if I took a shot, yeah. Yeah.
Funny enough, I was never a fan of that one.
Really?
And I watched the documentary. I thought it sucked,
Yeah.
personally, but some of the other stuff I absolutely loved. I just think, I don't know, never done anything for me. But I realise what it means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's again one of the things is the evolution of the art form. One of the things that's curious is that with anyone bar Leibovitz, every single one of the cameras used to take these pictures is technically inferior to even an entry-level camera by modern standards, simply because the advancements in technology, in digital sensors, in especially glass within lenses, have come on so far that even a basic camera nowadays is technically sharper and technically capable of more than these cameras could do. So again, you know, a lot of the greats here didn't have, well, they did have by those standards fancy equipment, but by modern standards it's not. It's, you know, it's mostly, a lot of the people who use these cameras, it is nostalgic, it is retro, it's people deliberately trying to go back to that deliberate complexity. But I mean, who here has shot film before? Out of curiosity, how did you find film versus digital? Like, what was it that attracted you to film, or conversely, has anyone gone from film to digital? Cost. Oh, so it's from film to digital. I was like, because I'm saying, yeah, not most people don't think, oh, I'll do film because it's cheaper. Yeah. Yeah. But what about anyone who went from digital to film, or went from digital back to film? If you'd been previously there, what kind of things inspired you to make the jump?
Because you can see, like, kind of can't see what you've done.
Mm.
So it is based on, like, your ability to a certain extent. You hope that you get more than one because it is expensive, but it's really nostalgic for me. It's just more, I haven't done a lot of film.
Yeah.
Other than like the point and shoot with Matic when I was younger, but this is like proper SLR, and I quite like the idea of trying and not being able to kind of chunk in the call.
Yeah, they take the picture, look at the back. We'll have a discussion on this at the end, because I'm aware this could take up the entire rest of the presentation. But it's a curious thing that anything those old cameras can do, you pretty much can do with a modern camera, but you don't a lot of the time, because the camera will do it for you. People don't think to do it, they let that happen. And a lot of traditionalists would argue that there's a certain loss there, whereas a lot of people who tend to be more forward thinking would tend to be like, oh well, the reason that these advancements are here, we use them because we've got them, and the greats would have used those as well if they had them. So, swings and roundabouts. I'm here to provide questions. I could provide answers, but they'd only be my opinion. Now this is again one of his most iconic photos. This was taken in Seville in 1933. Now, curious thing about this picture is Bresson was actually involved in the Spanish Civil War, which was from 33 to 36, but this was not actually taken there. Because of the kind of rubble, a lot of people assume that this is a kind of, you know, joy within wartime picture, but this slightly predates it. He didn't go back until 1936. But what makes this so interesting, and again what defines so much of Bresson's style, is this isn't set up. This isn't something that he was watching and waiting for. By the accounts of this, he was literally walking by. This was here, took the shot, and moved on. There's maybe, I think there's about 3 or 4 pictures within this series. He shoots quickly, and then he moves on. But the framing of it is so nice. The captures, like the faces are clear, the expressions on them. And that is what made the decisive moment to him, and what made him in many ways the master of that. This ability to look at something, immediately evaluate it, and then capture it, not just as a quick picture, but also as a quick, carefully composed photo. Now, curiously enough, Bresson was connected with a huge range of important historical events. Looking into it, one could almost say suspiciously, as we're going to see. There's a wide variety of things that just so happened to happen the day he was there. It has been pointed out to me that as a photojournalist, his job was to be there when these things happen. But for example, he was involved in, being French, he was involved in the Second World War. He was involved in the resistance movement there, and he was also there to document the liberation of Paris and the subsequent expulsion of the German soldiers and the repatriation of the French. But this is one of his most iconic pictures, which, funnily enough, is actually, this was taken alongside a video as he worked with filmmakers as well, which was, this was someone claiming to be a refugee hoping to get back into the city, but it turns out that somebody recognized them as a Gestapo enforcer. And so you can just see, like, this is mere seconds after this has been announced, and what actually happens is that woman just smacks her one. But the sheer look of, like, fury, the expressions on their faces, and particularly I like the fellow on the right-hand side just behind her head, because, you know, for them, this is the person that put them through all of this, and then they're trying essentially to get away with it. And so Bresson's managed to capture this absolutely perfectly, again, with the decisive moment. There's a curious thing in that he was sent across to India during their independence movement to do a piece on Gandhi as he was going through his famous hunger strike. So he did a series of portrait pictures of Gandhi, and one of the things that was remarked upon them was that because it was so peaceful, it didn't really have that sense of the kind of the danger and the problems associated with the independence movement, just because of everything around Gandhi and the influence that he had on people. However, much like Leibovitz and Lenin, literally the day after he shot the portrait series, Gandhi was assassinated. So he'd already packed up his kit and he was getting ready to go home, and then hearing about this happening, he was immediately there. And what's so interesting about this is that because he was so unobtrusive, his entire approach to photography was essentially to be a fly on the wall, he could capture very, very personal, very, very real moments. So something like this, where you've got the kind of the grief and the loss of this very personal moment captured in a single image. Again, just a few years later, he traveled to China towards the end of the Chinese Civil War and the fall of the Kuomintang, the Chinese government to Mao's Red Army. And so he captured the kind of chaos that was going on there, because as the cities were falling, there was massive amounts of sort of groups of people moving around, traveling. And so I particularly like this image simply because, first of all, it is so crowded. There's just so much going on, so many people. But again, all the faces are very expressive. Going back to a further point, that this is technically flawed because you've got some blur on some of the faces. But again, I would say that gives it that little sense of movement that creates the sense of urgency. So, but every single one of these pictures is not staged. He's not even waiting around for a lot of these shots. He is just passing by and happens to spot the scene either before it happens, having the sense of capturing what's about to come, or just simply within that instant being able to compose a shot very, very quickly. So in terms of Bresson's style then, I've talked greatly about the decisive moment. That is a big part of what makes his shots. But the thing is, you can do that. It's especially easy nowadays. You could, set your camera to continuous mode, have a memory card with 20,000 pictures on it, press and hold the shutter, and you would eventually capture the decisive moment through sheer, statistics. But what makes his pictures even greater is his grasp of composition and geometry. The fact that whenever he frames a shot, it's not just a simple flat two-dimensional picture. It's not just a person. Everything within the frame tends to communicate something about the shot. I particularly love this because this is a capture that could only have lasted a couple of seconds as someone runs down a street, but the framing of the steps leading up towards it, the composition with the light and shadow, everything towards that leads your eye into the middle, and again, an instant capture, but so nicely framed. And again, extra impressive about this is the fact that he doesn't crop any of these in post. Everything in there is shot at the time. So another important thing, which will contrast into some of the other people we talked about, is, again, he did no post-production. So what you'll notice in this is that it's very low contrast. There's almost no black point in any of his pictures. They're all kind of grey. And the reason for that is that he wanted to preserve reality as he saw it. He said that he didn't want to hide details in the shadows. He wanted to capture things as they were. In many ways, this was a revolution against some of the other photographers we're going to be talking about, who would emphasize more dramatic black and white pictures where the shadows would be very, very deep. So by going against that, he created a kind of unique style that really helps very much what he was trying to achieve. An interesting point I saw in an interview with Bresson with one of his colleagues who worked with him, was his actual style of shooting was almost unique. She described it as being like watching a ballet dancer. He would be constantly moving, constantly wandering around the street, always looking, always trying to grab the shot. But it wasn't just inspiration. He did talk a lot about the importance of inspiration and capturing the moment, but a lot of the time what he would do is he would see something and then frame it in his head and then go to move so that he would be in the right position to catch exactly the right framing. So again, with this shot, as a woman walks up the stairs and all of the birds scatter, your eye is still led in through the railing there. The temptation could be to, zoom in or crop the shot in so you've got just the woman and the pigeons, but there's nothing extraneous within this shot. Everything there definitely serves a purpose. And again, this, if you've ever studied photography at college or gone to a night class or anything, there's a good chance you've seen this, because this is often used as an example of composition and leading lines. This is a kind of a curious one, actually, because judging by the rest of the pictures that you see in the contact sheet, there's several pictures here where there's no bike in the shot. So unlike his usual inspiration-driven but still calculated work, this was a case where he found a location that was interesting and then waited for the moment to come to him. But the moment is by no means less decisive. The fact that he's managed to capture the bike exactly where it is, and again, this is not a case where he just fired away on continuous mode. This is him capturing the exact time, but again, all of the lines lead the eye in towards the bike. They emphasize the direction and the lines there.